am Haley Dale. I am a senior fellow in public diplomacy studies here at the Heritage Foundation. And one of the topics I have followed over the past many years is Russia's attempts at influencing democracies and policies throughout Europe and in the United States as well. Um, I have been blown away by the way a lot of people have discovered this problem since the last election. People who would previously not have been very interested in the subject. But it is of great importance, and now that it's here, let's talk about not just how the Russians are seeking to influence the political landscape, but also how they're trying to boost the American left in order to attack the American right. That is something you may not have heard that much about in the mainstream media. Russia's efforts to influence the American presidential election has received massive political and media attention. Equally important, but much less publicized, is Russia's interference through support of left-wing causes and groups opposing President Trump. That Russia is supporting American left-wing groups and have a hand in sponsoring others does not come as a surprise. Those of you who can remember the Cold War will remember that that is exactly what the Soviet Union also did, underpinning, for instance, the extremely destabilizing and vitriolic campaign against the anti-ballistic missile deployments in Europe. And of course, the same thing also went for the American peace movement, also sponsored by the Soviet Union. So there is a continuity of strategy, but the tactics have changed. Today's influence operations targeted at the US, right, include phony Facebook groups, Twitter accounts, trolls, and other internet phenomena. Russia's influence operations also include support for political and environmental groups, and disinformation spread through news outlets in the United States as well as Europe. As serious as Russia's targeting of the Trump administration is, however, it also has profound and wider implications for Americans' faith in their democratic institutions. Today, the Russians are playing both political sides against each other to great effect. The refusal of Democrats to accept the result of the last presidential election has been a huge boon, magnifying the damage done to Americans' faith in their democratic institutions. Russians' interference should be a concern for all Americans on both sides of the political spectrum. And Russia's sponsorship of left-wing causes should be fully exposed. In his wildest dreams, Vladimir Putin could not have hoped for a more successful outcome than the explosive political divisions in the United States caused by the last election. Today we have an amazing panel with us. We're going to start with Brad Patty, who is Senior Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Security Studies Group, an organization that delves into disinformation campaigns from various sources, the Middle East, Russia, and others, based in Arlington. Brad spent years as an advisor to the US military, helping to design influence operations in Afghanistan, many places. He holds a doctorate of philosophy in philosophy from the University of Georgia. Next, we will have Boris Zilberman. He is the Deputy Director for Congressional Relations at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. His previous work was with the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. He was born in Russia and speaks fluent Russian. He holds an MA in Global Security Studies from Johns Hopkins University. Following Boris, we'll have Stephen Blank, a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. He spent 25 years teaching at the U.S. Army War College, as well as other notable institutions, specializing in Russia and Russian strategy. He holds a doctorate in Russian history from the University of Chicago. And our final speaker today will be our very own Michael Gonzalez, who is a senior fellow with the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute of the Heritage Foundation. Before joining Heritage, Mike spent 20 years as a journalist, mostly for the Wall Street Journal, and many of those years in Europe, but also in Asia. He also spent time at the State Department as a speechwriter, and he writes extensively on the subject of identity politics. He has a new book. Is it just out, Mike, your book? 4 years ago. Okay, well, relatively. A Race for the Future, How Conservatives Can Break the Liberal Monopoly on Hispanic Americans. Mike holds a bachelor's degree in communications from Boston's Emerson College and an MBA from Columbia Business School. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panel. And Brad, over to you. Remain seated or come to the message, please.
After a certain number of academic conferences, I'm more comfortable standing at the lectern. So I'm going to speak today mostly about the recent history of American counterpropaganda, because that's going to give you the tool set you need to deal with the problems that the rest of the panel are going to be focused on. As Hella mentioned, the Cold War era counterpropaganda is reasonably well known to folks here. It was led by the U.S. Information Agency, which was a formal government bureaucracy that existed throughout the Cold War, but at the end of the Cold War, the Clinton administration decided to dissolve it as part of what they call the peace dividend. And the idea of the peace dividend was that we would just not have to fight the Cold War anymore, so we could save some money. We could stand down some of the things we'd been doing all along. And this was one of the things they thought we could do without. We wouldn't need to be contesting Russian, Soviet propaganda everywhere anymore, because there wouldn't be a Soviet Union anymore. So the U.S. Information Agency had run things like Voice of America, who I believe is here today, perhaps. There he is, yeah. And they had done this under the authority of the Broadcast Board of Governors, which was a quasi-independent organization in order to give it credibility. So it wasn't just another state-run propaganda outfit. It was, independent journalists overseeing the production of things that were nevertheless done in the interest of counter-propaganda, among other things. U.S. Information Agency was fairly successful when it was dissolved. A couple of components were kept. One of them is the Broadcast Board of Governors and its attendant organizations. And the other is the Foreign Broadcast Information Service. The Broadcast Board of Governors went to the State Department, and the Foreign Broadcast Information Service went to the CIA, where it still exists under the name of the Open Source Center. It's one of the better things that CIA does, if you ask me. So what went away was the centralized leadership and the ability to organize counter-propaganda operations across the government. And that seemed okay for quite a while. But on 9/11, Americans woke up to the shocking realization that people all over the world were celebrating these attacks on America, and they began to wonder why. Those of you who are old enough will remember that there was a lot of discussion about why do they hate us? That was a question that was unironically being taken seriously. And the answer that the government came to was that there were a lot of people all around the world who were preaching stories about America that were quite hateful, and these needed to be countered in some way. But without the U.S. Information Agency, how would you do that? Well, the problem is that there are a lot of messaging authorities within the U.S. government. The State Department does direct government-to-government diplomacy. It also has public diplomacy functions, which is to say diplomats talking directly to the people. The military has a whole lot of different messaging operations, not just public affairs. They have what they call information operations, psychological operations. These tend to be pointed at conflicts, and they can't be targeted by law towards the American people. In addition to this, they have electronic warfare operations where they can forcibly broadcast and overcome jamming in order to get messages into hostile areas, areas where the government is hostile but the population is thought not to be. We do a lot of this with North Korea in various ways. The Central Intelligence Agency has political warfare missions where they are able to actively promulgate information that's designed to influence political outcomes. Homeland Security talks to the American people in certain ways about threats that we face. The Justice Department does. The Health Department does, because sometimes we face biological warfare threats. We need to inform people about that. All of these various pieces exist in many different places, and there's not a coordinating authority, where there wasn't on 9/11, to try to put all of these things together. And we were thinking about things like, what if there's a biological attack like the 9/11 attack? How do we coordinate all of this in a way that will allow us to respond, and also to go out to the world, find the messages that are getting people to celebrate things like 9/11 and counter them so that people think better of our country. It's a very similar problem that we face today with the Russian propaganda situation. We need to know what the Russians are saying, wherever they're saying it. And by the way, this goes also for China, for Iran, for Qatar, and for a number of other places that are engaged in anti-American information operations. We need to be able to find all of this, we need to understand it, and then we need to think carefully about how would we counter it. And having thought about that, we then need to be able to tap all of those different messaging authorities, which exist in different government bureaucracies, under different leadership, and very importantly, they have different legal authorities. There are things that, for example, military public affairs, they're not allowed to say. And as I already mentioned, there are things that military information operations, they are not legally allowed to target American populations. If you need to communicate to Americans, that's off the table. But if you need to communicate the message in that way to a foreign population, it needs to be on the table. And you may need to communicate the message to both populations in different ways. So you need a coordinating authority. After 9/11, the absence of one became a serious issue. And to answer that, the military very rapidly stood up what was called the Deputy Directorate of Information Operations, DDIO, at the Pentagon. This was, at the time it was stood up, it had no personnel, it had no chairs, it had no place to put chairs. It was something that was being done on an emergency basis. And so a lot of it was done initially by federal contractors, more than it was done by military personnel, until they could find and bring on board the people that they needed to do it. And they assembled, as they began to put it together, they assembled a group called the Interagency Counter-Propaganda Panel, which was run by DDIO in coordination with the State Department and the CIA. And I worked for this organization, which is why I'm talking to you about this subject today. So the Interagency Counter-Propaganda Panel tapped the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, now the Open Source Center, as a way of looking at all of this collection that CIA was doing about what are people saying all around the world, radio broadcasts, what are they saying in print, where are these stories coming from? And then we have provided a level of analysis of what are the threats, what are the opportunities, how can you use the various different messaging authorities that American government agencies have. And then the ICPP, the Interagency Counter-Propaganda Panel, pushed that out to the various agencies to be acted upon. This was a stopgap measure. It was something we put together on an emergency basis, and it worked for a little while the Defense Science Board conducted a full study involving industry experts, government experts, veterans of the Information Agency, and others. And they put out a report in 2004 that made some recommendations. This report is still available online if anyone wants to read it, and I do recommend it. I also have brought, if anyone wants one, I have a copy of Chapter 9 of our grand strategy, which runs through all of this history and makes some additional recommendations. So if anyone's interested in that, come see me, and I'll either give you one of these copies or I'll send you a PDF of it. What the Defense Science Board recommended, a lot of it was really, really strong wise stuff about the importance of establishing credibility, that credibility matters more than anything else in conducting these operations, and therefore that you need to be transparent, you need to be honest, you need to do things that will build your credibility in the community you want to talk to. They also made one particularly unwise suggestion, which was acted upon and derailed most of this effort, which is why we don't have it to rely upon right now. And that was that the DDIO at the Pentagon was simply too underpowered to lead this effort. So they said, we need to move it to a place where there's at least a 4-star general or admiral who can take ownership of it and advocate for it. They're the only ones who will have the push within the military to move this. And so they recommended a combatant commander. Well, there are only 2 combatant commanders that have global responsibilities, the SOCOM and Stratcom. That's the Special Operations Command and the Strategic Command. Special Operations would have made a certain amount of sense because they've had the psychological warfare mission since the 1940s. Well, SOCOM for as long as SOCOM has existed, but the Special Operations community since all the way back to World War II. But unfortunately, there was some concern that because psychological warfare is frightening and it might undermine our credibility if people thought that we were intentionally starting from the perspective of engaging in psychological warfare, they decided instead to locate it at the Strategic Command, which, as you all know, is at the Crystal Palace out west under the mountain. It's not here in DC. So, as it turns out, that was a very distant place. Those folks don't engage in the same day-to-day relationships with people here in Washington. They don't, get to drop by the State Department as often as they might. It's all right. No problem. Russian, that's right. It's Russian interference. But anyway, it's a long way away is the basic point there. They don't have the same relationships. And ultimately, the other thing about Stratcom is that the people who do that work are very technically minded. They've spent their careers working on things like nuclear weapons, ballistic missile submarines. Communication was not really what they'd spent their career doing, and they weren't really sure quite how to think about it or how to take that mission and integrate it into what they did. So they did their best with it. They did an honorable job as well as they could, but it's not too surprising that it kind of fell by the wayside. And today, we're back in the same position, that people are saying, well, what do we do about these propaganda operations that we're suddenly alarmed about again? Where's the coordinating authority? Well, since Stratcom didn't work out, last year in the NDAA, Congress relocated this operation to the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. Now, the Global Engagement Center may or may not be the natural place for this either. The State Department, by law, has to engage in truthful operations, they don't necessarily have people who've been trained in thinking about psychological warfare or political influence operations. You might want, ideally, an organization, maybe at the NSC. But by law, this is where they put it. So this is what we need to work with right now. We need to support the GEC and what they're doing. And the GEC is under the Public Affairs section, and it is tasked with coordinating all of these various operations. We need to, therefore, help them to establish the understanding of how to do this and to make sure that they have access to the professionals that they may not have generated internally, so that they can engage in recommendations on the full range of counter-propaganda operations that are possible. Now, with that said, I think we take questions now or later at the end?
I think we do take them later.
Okay,
but
very good.
Thank you for laying the groundwork for
All right,
American
very good.
perspective here.
So that's the tool set, and if anyone has any questions later, I will be around. Thank you.
And the important work they're doing there, and they have had funds now that they have received, but have yet to allocate to grantees. And so one thing I would urge for them to do is, especially as we move into the fall, into the elections here and in Europe, that they start moving quicker with giving these grants out to those that have applied to them, for these projects to counter Russian disinformation, whether it's here or in Europe, which some of the grantees are looking to do. So I'm going to talk mainly about Russian influence operations on the right, but really as a whole, and some of the ways that the U.S. is responding. So Russian influence operations, disinformation, active measures, they're not new. They've been doing this for decades. What we're seeing today is really an outgrowth of the type of operations we've seen from Russia and the Soviet Union for decades. The difference is really the digital tools they're using now and the ways that Americans now consume information online, through Facebook, through Twitter, through more traditional means as well, like cable news. But the Russians are now much more effective at using these tools, these new tools for them, really, and getting their information really into the bloodstream of American society. And I think that's what we really saw in 2016 and what we see again today. If you've looked at the ads that have been released that were run on Facebook and other social media accounts, and it runs the gamut, and it is really aimed at sowing division amongst Americans, left, right, inter-left, amongst themselves on issues. Some of the issues that got probably run the most was on race issues, crime, immigration, all kind of touchy political topics. And the Russians don't have, they're not card-carrying members of the GOP or the DNC. It's about us against them. And so when we get into this left-right debate, it really helps them succeed in their aims, in my view. And they're doing things effectively to message the left, message the right. And you see, I think, how actually you pointed out some of their campaigns also on anti-fracking campaigns here in the United States and Europe as well. The Russians have been seen to be behind some of those similarly. So there's not, they don't have a political leaning. Their leaning is how can we create chaos, create outrage in the political system, and drive division. And I think we see that continue to be played out. And expect to see it continue into the 2018 and 2020 elections. And they're quite effective. And I think one of the things that really needs to be fully absorbed by both Democrats and Republicans, independents, whoever else, is that the Russians understand our political system and our kind of society much better than I think we anticipated previously. It's not in Soviet times where it was harder to get a read on what's going on in the street, but there's been reports that they sent out some of their operatives to purple states to just kind of conduct recon, to get a lay of the political land. And they were able to operationalize what they learned and really figure this out. And so while some of the images and the ads that they were using were fairly crude, they understood what they were doing, and then to really understand exactly how they're really operationalizing this information. And so I think the response and what you're seeing in Congress is a bipartisan response. You've got a number of bills out there now. Some of the things that I think could be most effective, the Trump administration got derided somewhat for how they released the oligarch list, which was mandated by CATSA, that they cribbed the Forbes list, but I actually saw that as an effective way of doing this, is creating a wide list, ensnaring as many folks as possible on this list, creating these folks that basically are now pariahs. And so they should double down on that. The April 6th sanctions against some of these oligarchs had the kind of largest economic impact on the Russian economy that we've seen recently. So the next round should, again, continue to kind of double down on that strategy of highlighting who the financiers around the Kremlin are, and where appropriate, sanction them. And the other item that I think is floating around there and it's gotten kind of a lot of worry in the Russian economy, and I think rightfully so, is targeting Russia's ability or sovereign debt, basically. ability of U.S. persons, in this case, to invest in Russian sovereign debt. And the kind of language that's floating around right now it would be targeting new Russian sovereign debt. So if you're a financial institution and currently hold Russian sovereign debt, well, if this action takes place, it may be devalued. You would not be in trouble for currently holding Russian sovereign debt. But why this is important, post-2014, when the post-Crimea sanctions hit and the economy started going down, oil prices started going down, they really relied on these funds and the ability of Westerners to buy up Russian debt to basically bail out key pillars of their economy, to bail out the cronies of the Putin regime when the economy was sinking. And so if you take that, if you hurt, I mean, again, it's not fully taking it away, but if you start to nibble basically and take off their ability to do that in the future, because what are sanctions about? I mean, it's not just about punishment, but it's your hope is that you're changing Putin's calculus and kind of his decision-making matrix. And if it is going to be harder for him in an economic downturn or another round of sanctions to raise funds to bail out the Rosnefts of the world, when the time comes, maybe he'll think twice about pushing further in Ukraine or continuing to help the Kim regime in North Korea evade sanctions. Administration has continued to sanction Russian entities that are involved in that recently. So how do you change Putin's calculus? And dealing with some of these macro issues beyond the designations is important. While it's great to see more designations and certainly supportive of that, how do you change that calculus? How do you change the game for Putin? Because what we know is, Putin is going to continue to aggressively prod and press against the national security interests of the United States. It's going to continue to undermine the global order and work with like-minded states whenever they see an opening. And they do that abroad there, and whenever they see an opening here, whenever there's an issue that they can exploit in the public sphere, we've seen them dive headfirst into doing it. And so expect more of that. And I think the more we get into this kind of red, blue, left, right, however you want to phrase it, debate, the more they're able to kind of cultivate that and keep churning this kind of distrust in each other, into the political system as a whole. And I think seeing a unified response from Congress will be important, but also from just kind of the wider swath of leadership in the United States.
All right. Thank you, Boris. Stephen?
Thank you, Hallie, and thank you for inviting me. By 2005, the Russian government had concluded that it's at war with the United States. Sergei Ivanov, then the defense minister, told the military academy that we're at war with the West. Not a shooting war, but a non-kinetic war, like the kind that's been described here, or what George Kennan used to call political warfare. That warfare is continuing and has not stopped. And what's more, Russia is following a distinct strategy. Now, when I say that Mr. Putin has a strategy, I don't mean to say that he is a Bismarck or Metternich or so forth. That strategy is, like any other human document, flawed, and also it's able to take advantage, as he often does, of tactical opportunities. But the fact is that if you go back and look at what they've been doing for the last 12, 15 years, there is a discernible strategy. And it involves really the whole of the state, military as well as everything else, including information warfare, which they regard perhaps as the most important element of contemporary warfare in the world. And they define it differently than we do. They see it as not only the kinds of things we've been talking about here, but also cyber strikes against targets, say cyber strikes against the Democratic Party headquarters and the Clinton campaign. And the same thing is going on all over Europe and in the Middle East. RAND just released a study about Russian information operations in Turkey. There was another one that came out from Ilya Zaslavsky about Israel. So it's not just us. They're in Latin America, they're in Europe, they're in the Middle East, and I suspect they're in Africa also, but nobody has looked at Africa lately. So this is an element of a broader strategy of what the Israeli scholar Dmitry Adamsky has called multidimensional coercion, or multi-domain coercion. We're here today to talk about the active measures and the information warfare. But you need to keep in mind that this is part of an ensemble, part of an orchestra, if you like. and Putin is the conductor. And the orchestra is one that is playing on all the different sectors: brass, winds, strings, information warfare, energy, finance, military operations, etc. This is an old story in Russia, as my colleagues have pointed out. The Tsarist government in 1905 had a 2 million ruble budget for influence operations in the French press. Because France was their ally, they were raising a lot of money on the French stock exchange, and they wanted to make sure that everybody thought Russia was a great investment, although it turned out it wasn't such a great investment. The Soviets took this to an even higher degree. If you read the two books by Mitrokhin and Christopher Andrew, you see just how extensive this was on a global level, and it has been, as my colleagues have said, revived in order to take advantage of the new opportunities and technologies that are out there. All those activities in the Soviet period, going back to the 1920s, were coordinated by what came to be known as the KGB, NKVD, and so on, earlier periods. These are the guys who taught Putin his business, as well as Putin. They ran those ops. They taught Putin and his generation how to do it. And then that legacy has been brought back or never left. So as I said, these measures, these active measures in information warfare are ubiquitous. They're all over. Moreover, we see stuff like this happening in Estonia in 2007, Georgia 2008, and there's a lot of evidence that we see the kinds of networks that had been built in the United States and in Europe, beginning not in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, but in 2012, when Putin comes back to be president and after the riots in Moscow. And when he realizes that, or he decides that the United States is irredeemably hostile, and we're even more going to have to be hostile to Washington as well. The tactics of these operations are very clear. As my colleagues have said, we exploit the ethnic, racial, political, and other cleavages in every country, not just the United States. You offer financial incentives to potential supporters in these countries. We're now learning about Brexit. Aaron Banks was offered all kinds of lucrative contracts with Russia in return for his operations to support Brexit. I think we're going to find the same thing here. We know that the Trump Corporation in New York, and it's a matter of public record, was doing a lot of business with Russian money launderers and so forth. It's all over the newspapers. It's not a political statement to say this. It goes back years. It's another form of creating financial inducements for people who want to cooperate with Russia. You create business connections, financial and political linkages that are transnational, and dependencies. Because some of these financial institutions come to depend on Russian money. For example, I remember I was in Abu Dhabi at a conference when the Russians invaded Ukraine. And I turned to John Roberts, the British energy expert. We talked about what is the British reaction going to be. And sure enough, they came out with some weasel words about this. And he said, sure, of course. The city of London would go broke if they took their money out. And, you can read John le Carré. He talks about it in fictional terms, but we've seen this in London, and you can see it if you go there, that Russian money is very strongly entrenched in London. They're making attacks against it now, but that's quite late in the game. Furthermore, the Russians exploit political rivalries. They subsidize political leaders, parties, and media, not just here. President of the Czech Republic, Miloš Zeman, owes his election to money from Lukoil. That's probably not just private money, or if it's private money, it was directed by Putin to a certain area because the owner of Lukoil knew, who's buttering his bread back in Moscow. They are willing to support any and all forces in the West who are opposed to European integration, which they regard as the great geopolitical threat, particularly in its democratic form, and therefore they are opposed to democracy. We've seen this in the European venue, support for Brexit, support for the intervention in the Dutch referendum, in the Catalonian question in Spain, in the referendum there, intervention in the French, German, Italian elections, subsidizing the Austrian coalition members now, and the Italian coalition members, Serbia, Greece, attempted coups in Montenegro and Macedonia, which, as we've seen, and the list is endless. And of course, we could talk about the new reports about Turkey and Israel. I can tell you also they're in Latin America. 4 years ago, Southcom asked me, I was at a meeting with Southcom, and one of the colonels said, what can we do about the fact that the Russians have the first two numbers on, RT has the first two numbers in Argentinian television? And I said to him, sir, there's nothing you can do, because by law, you're prohibited, as Brad has said. There are authorities that prevent the military from acting here, even though these are warlike actions. So they're all over the place, not just in the United States. But as we have now seen, and there's a tremendous volume of reporting here, the great majority of Russian attacks and probes in the United States are directed at not the left wing, but the right wing, the Republican Party, supporters of the Republican Party, lobbies that are clearly affiliated with the Republican Party, NRA. Primary example. When you read the indictment against Maria Butina, and you're going to see the trial reports and the other reports that come out about this, you see she was trying to infiltrate the NRA. She was involved with groups that are close to the Republican Party, like the Center for the Study of the National Interest. And she was at other functions as well, and she's only one person. I can tell you, my conservative friends, when they ask me to write articles, they complain to me about people like Patrick Buchanan, who are thinking that Putin is this great supporter of Christian values. He isn't, believe me. Russia is not a particularly Christian country, and what's more, the spectacle of, how should I say it, repentant KGB operatives becoming fervent Christians is more than amusing. Furthermore, the Orthodox Church is itself a KGB front, FSB front, excuse me, and has been for years, as anybody who studies this knows. Moreover, if you look at the figures on church attendance in Russia, they're not very impressive. I think it was 3 to 4% was the last one I saw. So, all this stuff about Russia being a Christian religious country, it's nice propaganda, but the reality is rather different. However, here, we've seen all these probes mainly at the right. There were to the left, like Jill Stein. If you remember the photograph of Flynn with Putin at dinner, the woman sitting there is Jill Stein. Now, I mean, there are Democrats who will tell you that, Stein may have cost them a lot of votes in those 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. I don't remember how many she got, but it may have had a factor. Now, beyond that, we know about Flynn. We know about Manafort. We know about the NRA. We know about the Center for the National Interest. We know they tried to hack into the Republican National Committee and various senators. They have attacked the Democratic National Committee in the Clinton campaign, as we all know. And they also have attacked at least 20 to 30 states' election commissions. That's as of 2016. What they're doing now is not a matter of public record, but it's clear they are doing it because the intelligence community has come out and said that that this is going on already. And they, as part of their cyber activities, they've attacked the American electric grid. This is all a matter of public record. I'm not making any of this up. It's nonpartisan. So the fact is that what's really at stake here is the integrity of the democratic process in the United States and abroad. Plain and simple. What are the objectives? Fracture domestic cohesion in all of these places, not just here. To elect a pro-Moscow president. They hated Hillary Clinton. Whatever you may think of Clinton, that's clearly they hated her. And they felt Trump would be much more pro-Russia. They're clearly disappointed by what has happened, but that's the motive behind all this in 2016 and why they offered to collude with the Trump administration, as we now know. They want to corrupt and discredit not only the American democracy, but the whole idea of democratic and capital L liberal governance. They want to force the United States to accept Russia as a global equal in a multipolar world, which would end the U.S. ability, A, to thwart Russia's imperial dreams in the former Soviet space, and it's our ability to affect what goes on in the Russian domestic system, because they regard that as the greatest geopolitical threat, not NATO. And therefore, that would mean an end to democracy promotion. All the organizations and activities in this country that are geared, in one way or another, to democracy promotion abroad would fall apart because they'd be discredited and probably underfunded and so on. So at the end of the day, we have a foreign policy that sort of takes its guiding principle from Virgil, of all places, in the Aeneid, where he has, I believe, in Aeneas say, and I can quote you in the Latin, si flectere superos nequia acceranta movebo. If I cannot move heaven, I will raise hell. Thank you.
Obviously, for this crowd, there's no need for translation.
No, but we're on TV.
No,
So.
I must say that the three of you have been incredibly disciplined. Each of you has gone exactly 10 minutes. I'm going to try to stick by that. One of the great things about speaking at Heritage always is the level of people in the audience. I want to recognize especially Jamie Kirchhoff, who's really one of the great writers on this issue, bringing to light human rights abuses in Russia, especially against the gay community. And so I'm glad that you're all here. I'm going to obviously sound the same themes that my predecessors have. Luckily, I have some different examples. Yes, Putin and the Kremlin are equal opportunity offenders. I really do welcome the newfound vehemence on the left and the media that about Russia. I wish we had him around in the 70s and 80s. But it is true that what Russia and the Kremlin want to do right now is just exploit their divisions, and they don't really care about whether they do it on the left or the right. And we have an open system, so Russia knows exactly what it's doing, and it knows that it's acting at a time of very heightened racial and ethnic anxiety. And how is it doing this? Well, identity politics has left Russia with very gaping holes in our society and divisions that it can try to get in there and try to open even further. And so we see this clearly with the pages that Facebook blocked just last month when Russia was last caught with his hands in the cookie jar. And I do apologize. I'm under the weather, so I'm going to pause and have some water. They blocked 32 pages. The three most important pages that are blocked all had to do with identity politics. One was Black Elevation, obviously meant to appeal to African Americans. The other one was Resisters, which was meant for feminists, get it? Re-sisters. And the third one was the worst, was Aslan Warriors, which was meant to play on the fantasy by some Chicano activists that the southwestern United States is a cradle of Aztec civilization, and therefore these states have to separate from the rest of the country. Now, obviously, Russia was trying to just create mayhem there, but not just virtual mayhem, real-life mayhem. The page Resistors, for example, organized a protest against the racist white supremacist rally that took place here in Washington in mid-August. Most of you remember there were like 18 white supremacists. They were outnumbered vastly by journalists alone, let alone the counter-protesters. But what Russia did was Resistors itself set up a Facebook event, set up a counter-protest. Obviously, what it wanted to do was have to replicate what happened in Charlottesville last year, where we had actual bloodshed when a young woman was killed by a white supremacist. So now real groups, co-hosted this event that was created by Resistors, by Russia actually, because Resistors was just a front. According to TechCrunch, quote, the event that Facebook deleted had been taken over by a handful of real DC area activist groups. They included Smash Racism DC, Black Lives Matter DC, Black Lives Matter Charlottesville, and other local groups. So this left many of them really disgruntled and really feeling badly let down by Facebook. One of the organizers was quoted by one of the tech magazines as saying, "This is really outrageous for us. It makes us look like we're Russian pawns." So is any of this new? As many of my colleagues have said, no. I don't go back as far as the Tsars, although that is true. But this is following the Soviet playbook. The KGB, for example, is very well known that it tried to it posed itself as members of the KKK at one point. It also fabricated evidence that linked the CIA to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It wasn't just Ted Cruz's father. It was just it passed the material off to unwitting conspiracy theorists in the United States. What the Soviets did, it forged a letter from Lee Harvey Oswald to a little-known CIA operative known by the name of E. Howard Hunt. And the letter said, asking for, before any steps are taken by me or anyone else, let me know what to do. So the forgery took place in the 1970s when Howard Hunt was much better known because of Watergate, his involvement in Watergate. I think much more worryingly, the KGB also tried to discredit the Reverend Martin Luther King by planting articles portraying him as an Uncle Tom, who was being secretly paid off by the government so LBJ could control Martin Luther King. Now, the New York Times, when it wrote about this in the 1990s, said these attempts were silly, but that is really forgetting the context in which this took place. This was a time when Malcolm X was calling Dr. King an Uncle Tom also, and other separatists, just because Dr. King sought peace and assimilation rather than separatism. There's an interesting aside here. A lot of these cases I've just cited were in the book by Mitrokhin, which is, I think you referenced. The interesting aside here is that Mitrokhin himself tried to turn himself into the CIA in the early 90s and was turned away. The CIA's Soviet and East European Division had at the time come to the conclusion, this is like 91, I think it was, that the KGB was no longer a threat and Russia was no longer a threat. So the CIA began to turn away Soviet defectors. Mitrokhin, being spurned by us, turned to the Brits. So, folks have been underestimating the Russia threat for decades. Even the New York Times, when it wrote about this in the 90s, said that the CIA had acted naively after the Soviet Union by underestimating this. Today, everyone has gotten the religion because they think that the left now wants to use this to attack a legitimately elected president. And in the age of Trump, it's the point of reference is no longer the New York Times, it's now Facebook. So how is Facebook dealing with this? Well, it's trying. It's hard. I mean, Facebook gets many things wrong, but it's doing, I think, trying to do a fairly good job so it doesn't get criticized by Congress. And the bad actors are getting much better at hiding their connection with Russia, which makes the job of Facebook and Google and everyone else and Twitter much harder. Facebook itself said last month when it announced it had blocked pages that, quote, it's clear that whoever sets up these accounts went to much greater lengths to obscure their true identities than the Russian-based Internet Research Agency, IRA, has in the past. So Facebook says it has to just lay in wait for bad actors to slip. In this case, there was a slip. It lasted only 7 minutes. That was enough. One of the accounts set up by the IRA that Facebook had disabled in 2007 had shared a Facebook event with these pages, especially the Resistors page. And the Resistors itself made the mistake of having the IRA account, an IRA account as one of its administrators for only 7 minutes, and that was enough for Facebook to realize what was going on and go in and block them. Now they're trying, Facebook, like its big tech monopoly sisters, Google and Twitter, is trying to thread a very difficult needle here. Is obviously the social media has brought a lot of, added a lot to the pursuit of happiness, but it's also being used, I think, it's being exploited by bad actors. And what I wanted to close with is that it's not just Russia. When I talk to my friends in the government, they're very aware about Russia and they're very serious about Russia. And there's a high level of awareness at all levels of the administration about what Russia is trying to do. But China really is also a bad actor, and it really needs to be discussed in this context. And it's not just social media either. China is also very sophisticated about trying to. I know this event is about Russia, but I have to bring in China. It's also is very sophisticated about trying to influence American public and thus American policy. And it does so in ways that sometimes we don't realize. Now, we've all heard about the Confucius Institutes. I guess, is about 100 of them now, and they take money, and what they do is they don't allow. Now they try to stifle discussion of the 3 Ts: Taiwan, Tiananmen Square, and Tibet. But less well known is what's happening with Hollywood, where China is telling studios, if you want to get any piece of our box office, incredibly ginormous amount, it's going to be bigger than the U.S. this year, if not by next year, you're really going to have to submit your scripts to the Chinese censors. And Hollywood studios are doing this, and sometimes they bring the Chinese censors on the set. Now, the beautiful people are not really hiding this. There's a beautiful quote by James Cameron, I think about 2 years ago, where he said, quote, "As an artist, I'm always against censorship. But this is an important market for me, so I'm going to do what's necessary to continue having this be an important market for my films. And I'm going to play by the rules that are internal to this market, because you have to. So, this is the same James Cameron who is incredibly, out there defending truth here in the U.S. He's Canadian, by the way. But despite his incredible candor, most Americans don't know about this. And what I've called for in the past is say, well, maybe in the titles to the movies, just say this movie has been submitted to Chinese censors. And the last thing I want to add is China's going out there and buying radio stations. It's doing that not just here, in Canada and Australia and New Zealand as well. It's trying to pass it off as an American radio station. And it's finding a loophole here to get around the regulations that we have. So just to sum it up, it's not it's Russia. Russia is really serious. It's a real adversary. I welcome finally the left has come around to seeing that it is an adversary that has to be taken seriously. But it's also not just social media, and it's not just Russia either. It's also China. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mike. All right, as we can see, we got our work cut out for us here as we're thinking about strategy to counter these daunting challenges. We're going to go to about 1:30, and I'd like to invite the audience to ask some questions of the panelists. If you do, please identify yourself by name and affiliation, and keep it short and keep it to questions rather than comments. So, any questions out there? Yeah, one right here in the second row.
Hi, Carl Gollivan, a retired special agent, U.S. Customs. I was a 9/11 responder. Domain reference and idea liveson.net. The conversation went way beyond Russia influence operations to touch on 9/11, and I'm amazed JFK and E. Howard Hunt came up in this context. So I do have to lay a foundation for a question. E. Howard Hunt confessed before he died in 2007 to involvement, along with several other named CIA personnel, in the plot to assassinate JFK. He claimed to have only been a bench warmer, but there is testimony in federal court that he was dispensing cash in Dallas. So Mark Lane, the trial, documented in the book Plausible Denial. So I don't know. I'll go to a question. 9/11. As a responder, I helped go through the rubble of World Trade Center 7, the third tower that collapsed that day, which in the West we have a complete blockout in the media that a 47-story building collapsed at 5:20 that afternoon, housed the largest domestic CIA office outside of Virginia. So I guess we have influence operations. We limit what the public knows. My question will be false flag terrorism. To what extent do both, well, Russian, US, NATO interests apply false flag terrorism to influence people in, their submissiveness to governing authority? And I would go back to mentioning JFK. Operation Northwoods, presented to Kennedy by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called for false flag terrorism on US interests to influence public opinion to support invading Cuba, including substituting drone aircraft in flight for commercial aircraft, bringing them down and using that as a pretext for war. So false flag terrorism, is it a reality?
That would be the question. And
I'm not going, last time I used the phone, it erupted in noise, so I'm not going to Google the thing about Howard Hunt just now. But I'm just going to leave that aside. I don't know about it. If anybody knows about Howard Hunt being involved in the Kennedy assassination, please do speak up. Look, when I'm involved in a war, I'm an American, and I care about American interests. And I don't ask how successful are we being at taking war to the other side. I'm asking how successful is the other side being at inflicting, getting in the way of our success. So if we do these things, as you say, I don't, it's not something that I'm concerned. I'm concerned about defending American society and Americans in this country. And that's really the only answer I can give you. I don't know if anybody else wants to touch on that.
Well, I can address the terrorism question in Russia. I mean, Russia's a state sponsor of terrorism, plain and simple. They are they have sponsored terrorist activity in Ukraine, Kharkov and Odessa. They have sponsored Kurdish terrorism in Turkey. That's President Erdogan saying that, not just me. They are the principal armorers of Hezbollah through Iran. And they probably have links to other terrorist groups. They're working with the Taliban. They're certainly sharing intelligence with the Taliban. They may be sending arms as well. So terrorism is another instrument of the Russian strategy, and where it suits their interest, because they're also victims of terrorism, to be absolutely objective. So where it suits their interest, they will employ terrorism as an instrument of war, as an instrument of Russian foreign policy. Now, you were talking about false flag terrorism, if I heard you correctly. Now, I don't know that they're recruiting people under false flags for terrorist purposes. A false flag is basically I come to you and say, I'm working for X, well, I'm working for Y, but you're sympathetic to X, so I know I have a leverage, or I can get leverage on you to give me information or support. I don't know that that's happening. I have no evidence of that, but I do know they're a state sponsor of terrorism, and very few people want to admit it.
Okay. So we have a question over here.
Good afternoon. Very simple question. My
Could you
name is
identify
Irma
yourself
Bridgeford.
first, please?
Yes, I did. My name is
no-
Irma Bridgeford. I'm a retired director of international protocol. Mr. Blank,
Yes?
you mentioned that Russia is also influencing very much in Latin America. You mentioned Argentina. I'd like to know if you know of what other countries this is happening.
Okay, Venezuela for sure. Well, they tried this in Ecuador. I think it's failed in Ecuador, Nicaragua, and of course Cuba.
Central America, no, I meant in South America.
All right, Venezuela, certainly there's a large Russian presence, although it may have diminished now because of the crisis there, because there's not much more they can do there. They certainly have tried it in Ecuador. They tried to, 10 years ago, for example, they had this major program, not only the one that Victor Bout was caught running on, trying to run weapons through Venezuela and Colombia, but they were trying to get intelligence cooperation and information networks with Venezuela and Ecuador, who at the time had a rather leftist government, against Colombia, our main ally in that part of the world. Now, in terms of Argentina, this is in 2014, they had the first two networks on Argentine television, RT. I think they still have a presence in Argentina, but the government is completely different, and the circumstances are now much different.
Okay, thank you. So not that much all over South America. One more question to the gentleman. I can't read his name, the last
Gonzalez.
one. Do you know if China has infiltrated in South America?
Well, one keeps hearing China is obviously, yes, it's very involved in Venezuela, as I keep hearing. I'm not a Latin Americanist, but China is very involved all over the world, so I wouldn't be surprised that it is doing the same things in South America that it is doing in North America and Australia and New Zealand.
Okay, thank you. We have a question also in the second row here.
Thank you. Howard LaFranchi with the Christian Science Monitor. Mike, I'd like to ask you, so you said at the end there that that you welcome that some on the American left seem to be getting this now, that Russia's influence and its attempts at influencing here. But that seems to be happening at a time when some on the right and some self-identified Republicans in polls seem to be going the other way. I might say polls where Putin is growing popularity. Recently, there was a poll showing that it's still small, but double-digit percentage of Republicans said that they would welcome Russian influence in elections if it was on the right side, on the right direction. So wondering why do you think that's happening, and what can be done or what should be done to kind of nip that in the bud?
Look, being somewhat wry also in welcoming the left to the threat that Russia represents under Putin. But obviously, I don't know why people say to tell pollsters the things they say. When I answer a pollster, my wife's like, "Why are you doing that? Put the phone down. You know, just why are you talking to a pollster?" You know, I guess I'll, I'm just, I mean, perhaps I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm guessing that some people think, you know, Trump got elected, get over it. You know, stop using this as an excuse to not accept his presidency. You know, I was in the Bush administration briefly, and you know, people are saying now, "Oh my God, I wish we could have Bush." The awful things were said about Bush, and the people who are now pressing John McCain. I looked at tweets. I should have told you to turn off your phone. You know, people, you know, I've seen some tweets by some people, I don't want to name him here, who are now praising John McCain, who in 2008 was saying he's spreading hate. You know, so I think that people, have, especially conservatives, have had it up to here with hypocrisy. So I don't know if that is this is a function of that, but I'm really speculating here, which I shouldn't do. Anybody want to handle that?
Yeah, I think there's a number of, first of all, I think it's the influence of President Trump, who has a very devoted following and knows how to appeal to people's emotions. And so there's a constituency out there that believes, like Mike has talked about. Second, I think, let's be frank, successful information operations. You have a whole school of Republican conservatives, and they're writing in public, and we all, you know, about how Putin is a strong defender of Christian values. Well, you know, that's a Russian operation that's been successful. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. This guy's going around murdering people. I mean, you know, I don't know what religion sanctions that, but there is that, and there's also a major problem. I speak as an old college professor. We don't educate people about civics, to use the old term. You know.
Well, we teach civics, or we teach it differently now.
We don't educate them. We don't. We may teach it, but we don't educate them.
No. It's a completely different civics. I agree with you. I mean, I think your point is very good.
Maybe that makes us easier to undermine.
Yeah,
I think so. Ignorance is always easy to undermine.
Yeah. Civics now is about marching in the streets and none of the things that are real civics.
Whatever it's about. But the point is, I can tell you, I mean, having been out in the front lines, that the extent of ignorance, and it's all over the country, it's not just in any one particular area, is appalling.
Yeah.
All right, do we have any other questions from the audience? This one in the back here.
Thank you. KT Wang with NTD TV. The questions is for Mike. Because you just talk about China trying to influence the democracy here, then how do you see the difference between Russia and China in their influence operation? And also for this upcoming midterm election, do you think China will try to also exercise influence? And do you have any example that how will they do to try to influence here?
You know, they obviously do it very differently, right? There was just a very good congressional report published last week on how China is trying to use its influence, not just through the Confucius Institutes, but by trying to use overseas communities and so forth. I encourage you to read it if you haven't read it. They behave very differently, but they're both spoilers. They're unlike us. They don't really have allies. They have vassal states, and they both try to disrupt open societies such as ours and other open societies around the world. I don't know if anybody else has something to add on that.
I lived in China for a couple of years, right around 2000, 2001. And I was very impressed with the Chinese propaganda operation. I thought it was tremendously well thought out and professional. I never once heard them say anything false, which is a key insight. If you're doing this kind of warfare, truth is a force multiplier. If what you're saying is verifiably true, then it's going to be more powerful. And the Chinese have brilliant editors. They tell the truth in a way that leaves out certain important facts, perspectives, contexts, and leads people to draw the conclusion they want you to draw on their own by facts that they can verify through their own research. The Chinese are really good at this. So I think we ought, as a professional, I have to accord them a certain respect.
All right, and I think we had another question here in the front row.
So accepting the fact that Putin has fan clubs both on the left and the right, and he will continue to do so, which is beyond my comprehension, and you've laid out our attempts to do something about it. I'm not terribly optimistic that we know how to handle this, that we know how to put a dent in it. And despite all the press that's come out about Butina and Dmitry Simes and others, I'm not sure that we're sort of breaking or making a crack or an indentation in this. And so how would you propose, any of the panelists, that you go about doing this? What's the future? And I don't think the GEC is necessarily the answer.
Well, it sounds like you might have an answer for this, Brad.
So you're right that I've talked a lot about government answers, and the government, we have a pretty ossified government. What I mean by that is that the bureaucracies we set up in the mid-century to fight the Cold War, really coming out of the Great Depression too, they're now quite old, and bureaucracies by nature establish more rules and more rules every year. So it becomes harder and harder to accomplish anything. This coordinating role that I was talking about is necessary, and we have to find a way to align all of these different authorities and all these different messaging capabilities. But you're quite right that the government probably can't do it by itself. It's going to need industry partners in places like Facebook, in places like Google, but it's also going to need a civic effort by the American people. As Helen and I were discussing before this panel began, what the Russians do is that they go and they find legitimately issues, like the Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter thing. Both of these sides really exist. There are real tensions between them. They both have a point to a greater or lesser degree. You can take whichever side you want, but they both have an argument. And it's part of our public discussion that we really need to find a way to talk through these arguments rather than fighting about these arguments. And if we come to see as a people that this is tremendously important for us to reason together rather than fight with each other, that's the way to get past Russian propaganda more than anything else. To stop feeling and start thinking.
I think you need to have political leadership. It hasn't been there for whatever reason. You haven't had institutional leadership either, as Brad knows. I mean, if you talk to people saying, at the management level or the board of international broadcasters and so on, oh, we can't do that. That's propaganda. We don't do propaganda, Private corporations have been remiss. I mean, Facebook, we see just how bad Facebook has been about protecting our privacy. They're not alone. We've had a lot of mismanagement. I mean, those of us who were in civil service like you used to joke that all our records are in China because of the great scandal 6 or 7 years ago when OMB records all were stolen by China. There's a whole bunch of other things going on out there. So Brad's right. You need government. You need private sector. You need institutional and civic leadership. But there also has to be a vision of what it is that you're trying to accomplish, by what means, and how. I don't know that we're trying to get our message across in any kind of really systematic, innovative way, other than Radio Free Europe and VOA, which, are great organizations, but are handicapped. To the Russian or pro-Putin community, I would take the war home to Putin. There's no reason why the Democratic National Committee should be the only one who's hacked. No reason why, for example, we can't try to find out where his bank accounts are and where his money is and go public with just how much he and his buddies have stolen from the Russian people, whose condition gets worse day by day. That kind of information, true information, not propaganda, true information, credibly reported, reliably sourced, is a force multiplier.
That's exactly right.
I would just add a couple points on that. Outside of growing kind of resiliency of the society to these types of operations, there's things that we could be doing here in DC. Fairer reform, for instance, is something that needs to be done, which would obviously this Foreign Agent Registration Act. Right now, it's too easy for people to be foreign influencers without having to register as such. And then naming and shaming, as we've seen in kind of some of these cases, that hopefully will make people think twice about engaging in these kind of questionable activities that maybe in the back of their mind they think, not sure who this is, what this is really about, where they're not maybe asking a few extra questions where they should ask of why this person is really reaching out to me or setting up these trips with me to Moscow or to Beijing or whatnot. What's really happening here? So some of these name and shame kind of, what the press is doing is important, and highlighting some of these cases, both on the China front, on the Russia front, but then also just changing some of our rules and regulations to make it harder for foreign agents to operate without having to declare as such.
We want to ask a quick follow-up. Yeah.
So what do you think about reintroducing the rules of reciprocity? Because a lot of what has gone on wasn't allowed in the 60s and 70s. We had when you were doing diplomacy, when you were doing economic exchanges, you have rules of reciprocity. So, for example, if a U.S. firm could not own property in Russia or in the Soviet Union, then that Soviet person could not own property in the United States. I mean, a lot of this happened after our own banking and loan failure, and people needed fast money, so they took it from China and they took it from Russia. But what do you think about reintroducing the rules of that? Why should an oligarch be owning the Brooklyn Nets and the stadium they play in when we couldn't, own a hockey team in the KHL? What do you think about that?
I think my preference in those cases would be if an oligarch is involved in sanctionable activities to go ahead and sanction them and seize their assets. I think that's probably, in the short term, an easier approach, but in the long term, I think that's probably worth a discussion how that would actually play out. In the Russia case and the China case, is the political kind of economic impact of that, is that footprint too big, and can you deal with it more with a knife as opposed to a sledgehammer? I think we need to see more designations though.
Okay, so we have a question in the middle row here.
Thank you. My name is Russ Henry. I'm here as a private person. I specifically, to Mr. Blank, you mentioned about the resurgent Christianity among many of the KGB or FSB personnel. Does this have anything to do with the possible schism between in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is basically centered in Ukraine, as I believe? Can you say something about that, please?
Yes. The Orthodox Church throughout Russian history has been an arm of the state. And it has also been an arm of the secret police, even going back to, in many cases, the Tsarism. There was no privacy of the confessional, for example. The church was obliged to inform on people telling them of seditious activity. As an arm of the Russian state, it is an arm of the empire. And there has been this trend, if you go through the entire Ukrainian history and try to look at the Ukrainian history objectively without polemics on either side or on the many sides of all these issues, the Russian Orthodox Church has always tried to assert that it is the main church and that Ukraine's Orthodox Church is subordinate to it. And that therefore the Russian Orthodox Church, and by implication, therefore the Russian state, have hegemony or leadership in Ukraine, and that they're the church that you should orient yourself towards. Now, they have tried to play this game with redoubled vigor under Putin, and particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, because this is a major issue in terms of people's cultural, national, and political identification. And so, without getting excessively long about this, the Russians have used the church as a political weapon and have militarized religion, in a sense, or weaponized religion as an arm of Russian state policy. And this has been going on for decades, and particularly we now see it in Ukraine. But we're also seeing it, for example, with regard to Serbia. Serbia, they claim, well, we have this Orthodox Brotherhood and so forth. So when the Russians and the Serbs want to be friendly towards each other, you have all these PNs to Orthodox Slavic Brotherhood. And of course, when they're not so friendly to each other, the shoe's on the other foot. I mean, just remember Tito and Stalin. Nobody was talking about Slavic Brotherhood there. Quite the opposite. I mean, they are attempting to use people's religious convictions as an arm of political warfare.
Right, I think there was, yeah, a couple of questions there in the last row there.
Thanks. Will Thatcher, Heritage intern starting in September. I was wondering, I think it was Mr. Zilberman who mentioned Russian operations in the anti-fracking movement. I was just wondering if you could go into more detail about that, about how they're doing it, why they're doing it.
There was actually a recent government report on this that I would point you to more of the details. But why they're doing it, it's a threat, right? Energy is one of their main exports. Cheaper U.S. Natural gas fracking is competition to them. They see there's a natural left movement for environmental reasons to go against it, so they are pumping money into those campaigns because at the end of the day, it helps their own economic interests to do so.
Yeah, next one right there.
I'm William Tomlinson. I'm also a Heritage intern starting in September. So given that one of Russia's main weapons is the use of Facebook, Mr. Patty, you talked about counter propaganda. What balancing free speech and state interests, what could the role of the U.S. government be in persuading American citizens to not vote solely based off things that they see on Facebook and to get a diversity of information?
So that's part of a really important question. The question you asked is, what can we do to educate voters? That's good. That's important. There are other things that the U.S. government can do with regard to Facebook that can help them to be a good partner for American democracy without engaging in viewpoint discrimination or other similar problematic features. We've had things in the past like the Fairness Doctrine, for example. That's a law that used to apply to broadcast television. Broadcast television was regulated pretty extensively because there was a very narrow set of bandwidths on which you could broadcast because there were only so many channels. So there's only so much attention. And therefore, they thought it was justified, the government of the era, to make sure that everybody was represented within that space, that all viewpoints were treated fairly. And if you had one thing you wanted to say about your side, you had to give the other side equal time, perhaps, or otherwise, to make some arrangements to make sure that they weren't suppressed. So one of the things that we need to do is to engage in voter education. That's something that the federal government doesn't necessarily have a huge role in. The Department of Education can push that down just with suggested standards to the states, but most of the education of American citizens is done at the state level or by private agencies. But the Department of Education can certainly work on trying to make sure that we have standards that we can suggest to them. But we should also probably look at dealing with these issues because these larger places like Facebook and Twitter, they're on the internet, which in theory is more or less unlimited. It doesn't have that broadcast limitation. But as you know from studying node theory, the value of a network is an exponential of the number of nodes that it has. So when you get to a certain size, as Facebook and Twitter have, they're not quite infinitely, but certainly exponentially more valuable than any alternative that could be set up. So they have a kind of similar bandwidth lock on American attention. And it might be worth looking at something like the Fairness Doctrine just to make sure that, propaganda efforts don't go unanswered and that viewpoint discrimination doesn't become an issue either.
I want to add something here, actually. I want to welcome you to Heritage. I'm going to take a different tack on this. As a former newsman, I don't want to go back to the Fairness Doctrine. I always tell people, I was tweeting today to Chuck Todd, I'm old enough to remember the bad old days of when Walter Cronkite, Harry Reasoner, and John Chancellor is all we had. And they were very fine men, very liberal, and they all lived in New York. And we have information democracy now. The new word, it's Latin, caveat emptor, buyer beware. It's on you. You have to be the filter. But I wouldn't leave it to Facebook or the government to monitor or police any of this. I would leave it. I want to be the one who, and I think I have a good filter now when I read something that looks to me like Russian propaganda. It and I search a little bit and see who pays the bills here at this information source, it is Russian propaganda. So I feel for you. I know this is a new burden on your generation that you're going to have to be the filter yourself, but it's vastly preferable what we have to what we had until about 15 years ago, I guarantee you. And by the time you finish with your internship here, I will have you believe this, I hope.
Otherwise, you'll be fired.
There's actually,
I want to add to that. Besides what Brad and Michael have said, we have to hold these corporations to account. I mean, these are giant corporations. They have enormous corporate power, as everybody knows. That power has to be held accountable, not just through congressional hearings, although that's certainly one case. We need to support investigative journalism to uncover these things. I mean, without investigative journalism, there's a whole series of scandals, not even related to these topics, but that we know about, that would have that would have been covered up, and heinous crimes would have gone unpunished, and so on. But for those reporters, therefore, organizations like Facebook and Twitter need to be held to account in the public domain, because they provide a tremendous service or product, as the case may be, but that brings a certain responsibility, which they're not going to live up to on their own, or in maybe cases can't. So we have to be there.
Right. Anybody else? Or have we talked this through enough for today? I assure you that we will not stop pursuing this topic here at the Heritage Foundation. And I hope that you'll join us for future programs as we drill deeper into the activities of the Russian government and its propagandists. So let's wrap it up. Say thank you to the panel and thank you to all of you for coming.
Thank you.